Everyone, welcome to day 3 of the Institute for Social Ecology Intensive for 2021. Today is going to be a short panel on dual power featuring 2 panelists, me and Mason. Some of the panelists that were going to join us had to drop today, but we will try to give you an action-packed dual power panel nonetheless. We will start off with a short explanation of one of the many projects involved in the Symbiosis Federation. And then Mason will give us a broader overview of Symbiosis Federation as a whole. So I'm going to start off with a brief spiel on a project that was formed about 4 years ago called Olympia Assembly.
Bill, was Emery also going to speak in part of this panel as well?
Oh, I thought that Emre wasn't able to join us today. I guess I misread the email. Emre will join us. Perfect.
I am here. Hello.
Awesome. So yeah, Emre and Mason will join us for the Symbiosis overview. Here, let me make Emre a co-host real quick. Perfect. Awesome. I thought that's good to hear. I thought less panelists would be able to make it today. Okay, so I guess I will start with a brief explanation of Olympia Assembly. So Olympia Assembly is a citywide organization. It's been around for almost 40 years. The original goal was to decentralize into blocks and into neighborhoods, for us to have actual block assemblies and neighborhood assemblies and federate throughout the city. Unfortunately, that has never happened thus far, although we do have some tenants assemblies and tenants councils that are really interesting that still exist to different degrees. But instead it became a citywide based assembly group in a city that has 50,000 people and one of the biggest per capita leftist populations in the United States, which is simultaneously not saying much, but also does enable Olympia to have a certain kind of composition, population-wise, ideology-wise, etc., that enabled us to organize pretty easily there compared to other places. By having 50,000 people in the city, protests of about 30 people were able to have much more of a dent than they would otherwise, for example, right? Comparing this to somewhere like Seattle or Portland, you'd have to multiply our population 14 times over to get a comparable kind of size comparison per capita. So Olympia Assembly has a points of unity for decision-making and shared practice. It's rooted in direct democracy, direct collective decision-making through deliberation, non-hierarchy, not using hierarchical processes in our own organization and opposing hierarchy in the content of the organization that we're building, ecology and ecological stewardship, making sure that we are making decisions that are in harmony with certain ecological principles, direct action, people taking direct activity to solve basic problems and meet needs, specifically in regards to oppositional protest is what most people think of when it comes to direct action, oppositional politics more broadly. But direct action also has another definition referring to kind of more broadly direct self-activity. And also mutual aid, getting together directly with people horizontally to meet one another's needs. And collective solidarity, not just making it about our backyard, but making this a project that hopefully goes beyond Olympia in regards to the kind of actions we do, in regards to the kind of groups that we work with, etc. And we make decisions within those basic points of unity, and we have more minimal bylaws that are in harmony with those basic points of unity. And those are distinct from points of unity for ideology, right? So people don't have to agree with our special sauce libertarian socialist ideology to agree that they want to participate in this group along the lines of direct democracy, direct action, mutual aid, etc. And in that structure, people make proposals, we have a discussion about them that includes agreements, disagreements, amendments, alternatives, etc. And we make that kind of open discussion. It doesn't use Robert's rules, for example. And then we come to a collective decision, usually through consensus, but that's because it usually happens organically after discussing that. And if consensus doesn't happen, we have a majority vote when we can't reach full agreement. And when that's the case, we can usually live with the vote, even if we disagree with it, because it's at least within certain minimal principles we agree with, which makes things very easy to disagree in many ways, or at least for most decisions. Even though, some content you might think is ignorant, or you might think is counterproductive, or isn't going to work, or strategically a waste of time compared to people put resources other places and energy other places. But nonetheless, we're able to live with disagreements pretty easily because of the large amount of agreement we have in regards to shared process, basic shared practices. And we additionally form various collectives. So all of the policy making is made at the General Assembly, which will happen monthly. And then that General Assembly has multiple embedded collectives that then self-manage within the overall mandate and limits of the policy that's then created below at the General Assembly. Most all of those committees are completely open committees, and some of them will be made of people particularly delegated to be in that committee for various reasons at different times. And some of the different groups that we have joined, so you can get an idea of the kind of content that we do and not just some basic formal and structure kind of stuff that Olympia Assembly has, include something called Olympia Solidarity Network, which is a direct action network. And we basically do any kind of direct action. It's based off of Seattle Solidarity Network and other similar kinds of projects. And this is distinct from, for example, a traditional union that's going to be working at the point of production with workers in particular. We'll work with tenants is one of the main people we work with, but also we've managed through Olympia Solidarity Network to work with all kinds of people for very creative direct action projects. It doesn't have to be limited to just tenant projects and just worker projects. And some of the things we've done is getting people stolen deposits back, getting people stolen wages back, getting repairs done for an entire apartment complex with over 100 people in it, and getting the abusive property manager to leave that position. Stopped private security companies from policing downtown alcoves and kicking houseless people out of alcoves of stores that they sleep in downtown because of housing crisis. And we did those kind of above things through direct action campaigns. And those direct action campaigns would be creative. They'd involve everything from a demand letter delivery with 20 to 40 people delivering a demand, to protests, occupations, pickets, other kinds of nonviolent direct action, you name it, phone zaps, internet campaigns that would then be targeted towards trying to achieve a specific goal for tenants, workers, houseless people, or for a specific direct action campaign more broadly that might not even necessarily have people with grievances initially coming to us, but being dealt with in the sense of this is like an issue that's affecting the community and that we can actually propose those ideas ourselves at times. And another project that was formed was Mutual Aid Mondays, which still exists, now called Mutual Aid Partners. And that was a coalition between Olympia Assembly and a bunch of other groups that was formed through Olympia Assembly. And it's kind of exactly what it sounds like. It's a weekly mutual aid program that's been going on for years. And it's kind of like a more epic version of Food Not Bombs in a certain sense. However, we go far beyond food. There's stuff like sleeping bags, toiletries, basic hygiene materials, boxers, socks, you name it, tents. And of course, the mutual aid projects are going to be something that try to distribute resources to those most in need. And they've also been ways for not just the most dispossessed and the most oppressed in society to get resources, but also for working class people as well. However, the mutual aid program themselves will exist at autonomous houseless camps. So it's specifically accessible to the houseless population, although goes beyond that, which is really important for the mutual aid projects to be multi-directional, gift giving and resource distribution to meet people's needs. And additionally, there's been the Van Gardeners, which is a radical gardening collective that has done everything from reforestation kind of projects to community gardening and stuff around decommodifying food. There's the Abolish ICE Collective, which was involved in direct action against various companies that were invested in the private prison system related to the ICE detention centers. And that campaign, that escalated campaign against the various banks and financial institutions invested in things like Geo Group was very successful. It was co-organized with many groups throughout the country, and that would involve just waves of bank shutdowns throughout the country that wound up leading to mass disinvestments. And additionally, there's the Olympia Medic Collective, which is still around, and that is a collective that provides first aid resources to people specifically in direct action protest settings, however, also providing first aid resources to people on the streets of Olympia generally. And there's been tons of solidarity actions with other groups, things like monthly reading groups, putting on yearly May Day events, fundraisers for causes like Rojava, for humanitarian aid there, and other kinds of causes, other local causes, and participatory budgeting through voluntary dues that people can give. We have a thing where no one's turned away for lack of funds in Olympia Assembly. However, through people giving a bit, we're able to have a pool of resources. We have, let's say a few $100s at any given time that we can put towards interesting projects. And additionally, some more recent stuff, although Olympia Assembly has been relatively dormant lately, and it will emerge hopefully in some form relatively soon. Something that was more recent was an Olympia rent strike effort where over 5 tenants councils were catalyzed, and a few of them still exist, which is pretty interesting. And that was the kind of closest to decentralizing into different neighborhoods, which what's been kind of nice is the tenants councils that have been active and still around are completely autonomous, doing their own thing. And which is nice, because then Olympia Assembly doesn't need to put resources into helping them as much. They can kind of be self-sufficient, which has its pros. In general, Olympia Assembly tries to provide mutual aid to various projects that are formed through it, but it's always good when projects emerge and wind up branching off as well. And also Mutual Aid Fire Brigade is another project that emerged during COVID, which helped with mutual aid resources during the fire disaster on the West Coast. And recently, something that's emerged from Olympia Assembly is a study group on libertarian socialism and especifismo in particular. And some kind of understanding of the scale of Olympia Assembly is during our usually monthly meetings, we'd have anywhere from 20 to 40 people attend them, and including members from all of the different collectives Olympia Assembly is connected to, all the different committees, all the different more autonomous groups that have been formed. The membership on an average month would be regularly over 100 people. And additionally, there'd be these seasonal assemblies that would happen. We try to do them every season, but they often wind up happening 3 times a year or twice a year. And at those seasonal assemblies, we would try to make a huge effort to reach out as far as we could. And there we'd get over 100 people showing up to them. And then those people would often help the various projects that they help form at that seasonal assembly. Those seasonal assemblies would serve as kind of direction for the next couple of months in many regards about the kind of projects that we'd be focusing in. And that is a brief summary of Olympia Assembly. And without further ado, I will hand it over to Emre and Mason to talk about Symbiosis Federation, which is a group that Olympia Assembly is a part of and in part influenced. Emre and Mason, who should go first?
Mason, you want to continue?
Sure. I'm going to talk about 2 organizations really briefly. One is the local group I'm part of in Detroit, Michigan, called Detroit Build and Fight. And then second will be about the wider network that both us and Olympia Assembly are linked to, and how these like different scales can work together in mutually supportive ways. So Detroit Build and Fight is a radical organization in the city of Detroit that's focused on developing the solidarity economy and building up dual power in the city. And this is basically the idea that we want to develop a base of political organization and directly democratic decision making that is outside of the state, through which we can channel people's political action and become a counterpower to the system as it currently exists, in an attempt to displace it. And our model of organization is pretty different from Olympia Assemblies, even though a lot of the same basic principles that we're trying to bring into existence and make part of our internal practices are the same. And so the situation in Detroit politically, when one is trying to build a new system of participatory democracy, is that there are many pockets of these kinds of mutual aid and solidarity economy practices and community organizations that already exist all throughout the city. I think Detroit probably has the most diverse and flourishing solidarity economy landscape of any city in the US. And so one cannot simply enter into this space with, a very clear ideological program. We are a revolutionary organization that's trying to democratize Detroit, and also attempt to be an open political space for individual neighborhoods to enact their own self-determination on these two fronts. There's kind of a contradiction to be navigated between preordaining the political content of these kinds of community organizations and them actually being sufficiently open such that any person in a given community can participate in them and shape their direction. So the model of organizing that we've pursued to try to navigate this and balance this is what's called organizational dualism, or sometime, another version of this is what Phil's study group is diving deep into, is the organizing model of the specificismo, which for all intents and purposes is the same thing. The basic idea is that we build a cadre organization of revolutionary organizers who share a common program and have a set of unified goals that we're going to go out into the world to try to pursue collectively. And outside of that, independent of that, is the construction of the mass organization, which is these bodies of community assemblies. In Detroit, the basic form of this is the block club, which are these hyper-local community organizations that exist on streets in different neighborhoods all throughout the city. So those are politically neutral. They're open to anyone in the community. And so how we see our function in this landscape of trying to build revolution in the city of Detroit is to insert ourselves into block clubs and tenant unions and community garden projects around the city, or to develop them in an open, politically neutral way in the places that we live, or at least ideologically neutral. Certainly everything we're doing here is political. And using the network of revolutionary organizers that we've built to attempt to stitch these together into a more of a unified citywide, or at least district by district federations of block clubs, which is something that's been emerging over the past year or two in some really exciting ways, at least over here on the west side. And so it's a little bit of a different model from having kind of a single organization that is the home for the different kinds of things that Phil is talking about. And really our focus is on making sure that people who share our radical politics are not just talking to fellow revolutionaries, but are doing mass base building work in their own neighborhoods or in their apartment buildings or in their workplaces to bring in larger numbers of regular people who are the missing ingredient for real revolutionary mass politics. And so we've done a number of different projects on these lines. This summer we're doing a bunch of different internal trainings. We've been running some self-defense trainings and have done community defense trainings with the People's Defense League. We're going to be doing some street medic training and different kinds of organizer trainings. How do we build up the skills that are necessary to build a block club in your own neighborhood, and things of that nature. How do you what kind of facilitator skills do you need to be able to do this kinds of things effectively? So we've been working on that. We've been doing community garden work and doing different kinds of support for mutual aid projects from the city. But the most central part of our work is us as individuals, often our own block clubs and community organizations, trying to build those up, deepen the base in individual neighborhoods, and use that as kind of the foundation for any kind of possible revolutionary politics in the city. And so there are all kinds of different community organizations around North America who share Short Build and Fights and Olympia Assembly's basic orientation to struggle, that we are trying to build mass organizations of ordinary people that can form a directly democratic counterpower to the state, and using that as the way to pursue revolutionary politics on a local level. And so beginning back in 2017, some organizers from these different groups have been in discussion about how we can better learn from and support each other's work, and in lots of ways avoid reinventing the wheel. I think from our first discussions at the 2017 ISE intensive, I think one of the main takeaways was that a lot of these different groups had made very similar errors in basically responding to the Trump election crisis and other things, and we wanted to have a more intentional space for sharing our experience and the knowledge that we've accumulated through practice, through actually going out and trying to do it. And so this came together as an idea for trying to put together a federation or a network of some kind between these different direct democracy projects around North America, so that we can more intentionally be in ongoing communication, sharing our experience and knowledge, have other people you can go to ask about things that you would like to try and know have been done successfully in cities. And so that became Symbiosis, which was more officially kicked off at a founding Congress in Detroit about a year and a half ago. The other two intentions for this project, beyond just the knowledge sharing aspect, has been second to serve as a sort of common platform for this kind of political organizing, this kind of movement work, so that interested people who see something that Cooperation Jackson is doing and wants to know, how can I do this in my own community? We have kind of a support network in place that they can tap into get direction and resources, even get connected to people in their community that we're already in touch with, to help seed new organizations like this in places where they don't already exist. And so that's kind of what we're starting to transition into. I think there's been lots of really productive exchanges internally, kind of learning from what one another have been working on, but are only just now starting to have some infrastructure in place for supporting people in forming new organizations. And in the next couple of weeks, I think we should be announcing 8 or 9 new member organizations coming on board, which is pretty exciting. And then the last kind of movement function of Symbiosis as a network, that's a little bit more down the road, is an aspirational goal that we think it can serve a purpose for. It's creating the capacity for coordinating our work beyond the local level. Capital and the state are not only organized locally. We have to challenge them locally, but if we're going to defeat them, we need to be able to match their scale of organization. And that's going to require having means of decision making and communication, and coordination that's happening between cities, between regions. And so that's kind of like what we're aiming to have the ability to do. I'm sure that will take many years, but we're going to build it bit by bit. Yeah, I think I'll leave it there and hand it over to Emma.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. If I may, I will bore you with a PowerPoint presentation to help me, organize my thoughts. I'll try to share my screen now. Can everyone see?
Yes.
Perfect. So I'll try to briefly talk about the power in Rojava. Brief introduction. I am Emre Şahin. I'm a PhD student in Binghamton University. I'm from Northern Kurdistan, Bakur, which currently I'm at right now. And yeah, I was in Rojava 2 summers ago for 2 months doing field work on my dissertation, which is about cooperatives, the organization of cooperatives and communes in the region. Particularly, I looked at economic cooperatives and women's day. I'll try to focus picture. I'm pretty sure all of you are familiar with this, but just as a habit, this is the region that I'll be talking about, the region marked in yellow, north and east of Syria. I was able to visit 13, 14 cities along the Turkish-Rojava border and Haseke. And brief historical polling. The people of the region did not really have any autonomy or any type of dual power setting until recently. Rojava had been occupied by the Ottomans for 4 centuries, and then brief French colonial presence, and then in the 1980s, the Ba'athist party took hold in Syria. The organizing in Rojava that I will be talking about, well, I would argue, began with Abdullah Öcalan's arrival in the region right after the 1980 coup in Turkey. For 3 decades, the PKK organized clandestinely, set up local councils, communes, and all of these became more formal and above ground, to put it, after the Syrian civil war began in 2011, or so in 2012. Over the past 10 years, the region has been plagued by, the war and the embargo, but people have been able to create there's a strong do power project that's taken back. Just to give an idea, and the emphasis on anti-authoritarianism in the third paragraph, as you can see, anti-militarism, anti-centralism, it's key. And people are building a pluralist, revolutionary society in one way. I will use some concepts. I'll borrow some concepts from Rojava, where he used in his territories in resistance book some trends that he identified with, 21st century prefigurative movement. I guess one of the one that's most related with dual power is the horizontalist take on politics. Just one, sorry. So I briefly the refusal of vertical political organ and produces egalitarian relationships. In Rojava, there's around 4,000 local and regional assemblies at different levels. There's 4 levels of organizing, and these communes, these local councils, their membership vary from as low as 20-30 to as high as 300-400, depending on the size of the street, the district, etc. And the dual power stems. I mean, these councils all across the region exist, and the dual power situation exists. They are existing hand in hand with Tevdem, which could be seen as the more central. I don't want to say vanguard, perhaps vanguard, but the central organizing. Tevdem, Tevgera Civaka Demokratik, translates as Movement for a Democratic Society, and it's based out in. Its central office is based out in Dirbesiye and Kamishlu, and it works with all these local and regional neighbor councils. One important thing to note is all of these councils, let's say the street council has 30-40 members. They choose co-presidents, co-representatives that would go and represent the neighborhood in the district councils, and then similarly the district council would choose 2 co-representatives, 1 woman, 1 man, and they would go to the regional one, and at the end the last level is the People's Council that operates all across the region. And one important piece I wanted to add is the veto power lies in the level below. So if some decision has been taken in the second or third layer, the below councils have the veto power, and not vice versa, not the above ones. So yeah, all of the decisions of the upper councils must be formally adopted by the lower councils. And at each of these 4 levels, commissions exist in the following 8 areas: politics, economics, and defense, women, justice, ideology, civil society, and free society. Another important, I guess, slowly I'll move away from discussions of horizontality and dual power. Another, I guess, Zibetchian trend that can be found, a principle that can be found in Rojava is the autonomy, both from the Syrian state and the other states in the region, but also from the market. There's a relatively high degree of autonomy over the past 10 years compared to the past. The autonomous administration of northern Syria is sort of the political equivalent of Tevdem, as in it's the more central administration, and it until now it has held relatively good relations with the US and some European countries, but has faced great hostility from Syria and particularly from Turkey. The autonomy from the global market and its neoliberal operations, it's made possible by the material autonomy and capacity that the region has to provide for self-sustenance. However, this is a little tricky because the war and the embargo have a dual effect. On the one hand side, the war and the embargo limits access to the market, and can be seen as a good opportunity to expand self-sustenance and material autonomy. But on the other hand, in times of war, this isolation puts extra burden and limits the growth of cooperatives in the region. Although the number has varied throughout the past 10 years, between 200 and 300 cooperatives have been actively operating, and all of these cooperatives, majority of the cooperatives are not workers' cooperatives. Everyone who's a member also has a stake. So most of them, people are not wage workers. They're, owned by all the members of the cooperatives. Majority of the cooperatives are agricultural, since that's the main economic activity in the region. But you can find other types of cooperatives based on the specific needs and demands of different parts of Rojava. For example, during the war, there were several cooperatives, several generator cooperatives that were formed because access to electricity has not been 24/7 as regular, so people would come up and determine in these local assembly meetings that they have the need for a generator for the neighborhood. So that from the assembly would grow a cooperative in that neighborhood to form a generator cooperative. People would pool their resources and use the generator collectively for when the electricity is cut. Almost all of the cooperatives in the region are born from these local assemblies and communes, which shows the sort of organicity of the growth of cooperatives. Gender equality has also been defining, I guess, principle of the revolution, and not only in issues that directly affect women, but all other issues, all social, political, economical issues where there's organizing, there's women's autonomous organizing. So during my field work there, I was able to visit the cooperatives offices. In every town, there's that little office that, you know, helps coordinate different cooperatives and, you know, assists in their establishment. So these cooperative offices have the women's cooperative office equivalence. And this is an example from the economic field, but similar examples can be found in, let's say, the political organizing. All of the local, district, regional assemblies have women's assembly versions. So women are member of both, right? In the general assemblies, the gender, like mixed gender assemblies, they actively participate. All of these assemblies, meetings, organizations that I talk about have gender quotas. Both genders, their participation has to be above 40%. So, you know, between 40 and 50%. And co-presidency with one man and one woman. And this, like I said, applies to every field, from the military field, you know, the army, it's mixed gender, women's only army, from the military to the assemblies to the cooperatives, the media offices. These principles of autonomous women's organizing, gender quotas, and co-presidency system exists. Another defining characteristic, I would say, is regarding the environment. All above and underground resources are described as part of the commons as collective property, neither public nor private. And there's an active attempt to, you know, deindustrialize agriculture and move away from mono-agriculture, which was imposed by the Syrian for decades in the region. I have a couple of specific examples that I wanted to share. Of course, Murray Bookchin's ideas have been influential, not just when it comes to the to issues of environment, but overall in terms of municipality and, you know, dual power, but particularly regarding the environment, the ecology of freedom, and the other one, municipalism. They're like required readings for all the, not only the guerrillas there, but the organizers there. And Bookchin's call for the reorganization of our societies through the principle of some examples are Shulan 2012.
Looks like we lost him completely.
I'm sorry about that. I have I have limited internet access here. Sorry for that.
You started cutting out when you were talking about required reading.
Oh, okay. So I was saying the ecology of freedom and the, I forgot the title, the book on municipalism. Yeah, two books. I forgot the second book, but the ecology of freedom and the other one are required readings for both the guerrillas in Rojava, but also the organizers. I was saying some specific examples of this green approach to organizing are the People's Economy Plan that was introduced in 2012, which calls and requires all economic activities to be ecologically sound. And another one is the Feed the Revolution campaign in 2012. And of course, the Internationalist Commune in Rojava has been active in this area too, with the Make Rojava Green Again campaign, expanding reforestation, expanding the use of agricultural fertilizers, etc. And I see that I'm running over with my time, so let me quickly, let me quickly move on sorry, to education, I guess. Sorry, I'm a little distorted after the after disconnecting. I guess one key thing I wanted to add before wrapping up is all this transformation. It's arduous. It's not without problems. One difficulty has been bridging the gap between central decision making and decentralized local decision making. And the revolution in Rojava is very much based on Abdullah Öcalan's ideals of democratic confederalism. For those who may not be familiar, Abdullah Öcalan is the founding member of the PKK, and the PKK, which had a Marxist-Leninist ideology during its first 2 decades between, during the 1980s and 1990s, began to transform in the late 1990s to a more, I guess, democratic confederal or anarcho-communist model. And the idea has been to reduce the role of the party as the vanguard party shaping society, but have the party shape life along with society. So this transition from this central statist Marxist-Leninist organizing to anti-statist grassroots organizing has not been without its problems. I would say these problems, though, people approach as not moments of crisis, moments of counter-revolutionary crisis that weaken the momentum there, but as opportunities to exploit and as opportunities to make sure that decentralization takes place in the relevant issues. And education has been key. There are, formal education institutions such as schools, universities, such as Rojava University and Kamishlo and Kobani University, but there are also academies that work in a complex way. Remember the 8 areas that I mentioned: economics, politics, gender, etc. So in all these 8 areas, there are academies, and all these academies are, places where more and more organic intellectuals are, growing up, to say. There's a big emphasis on the commodification of knowledge and education, and it's very, very common to have members from these academies go to other spaces and deliver, panels, workshops. It's very easy to see, let's say, a genealogy academy member going to YPJ barracks and have a panel about gender in the military, or have a youth academy member, or have a youth academy, or have a cooperatives academy, cooperatives and communes academy members go into a youth organization space and talk about like decentral economic organizing for the youth, etc. So these academies hold great importance in the evolution of the revolution. There is some sort of a dual power situation when it comes to self-defense as well. Unlike, you know, the Weberian sense of the word where you know, rests in a central body, self-defense has been decentralized from civilian women's units. There are several subgroups of armed groups that come together under the umbrella of Syrian Democratic Forces. So I'll shut up before taking more. Thank you.
All right, well, I guess it is time for Q&A. As usual, if you have a question you want to ask, put an asterisk in the chat and we will get to you as soon as we can, and also specify who the question is for or if it's for everybody, etc. Thank you so much for that presentation, Emre. I had no idea we have a Rojava presentation today, and also coming from Iraq. It's amazing. Thank you so much. And yeah, so let's see some questions. I think there were some ones that were further up that we could go to as well.
Yeah, there's a lot in the chat.
Yeah, I think I saw David was the first one. Would you want to ask your question, David? Well, if not, I could ask it. It's, do the revolutionary cadre share an ideology? And this is in regards to the revolutionary cadre you were talking about, Mason.
Yeah, I mean, that's the basic idea, is that we have an ideologically specific organization that has a clear program and common strategy, and then we go into the, you know, help build up the different kinds of community organizations and try to influence them from the inside.
And that can be, real quick, contrasted to, for example, the block assemblies that Mason's talking about, and also contrasted to, for example, Olympia Assembly, which might have a common program of sorts, but not necessarily common ideology between members, right? And Brian has a question. Brian, would you like to ask that?
Sure, I suppose I can do that. Very straightforward, just curious, what changes people anticipate in your organizing and in your organizations in the coming period compared to pre-COVID?
Well, speaking for like our block club and neighborhood organization here, COVID was super devastating. You know, lots of our members are older, and say like the median age of people who participate in the block club is 50 or 60, and our participation dropped off a cliff when we had to switch to online meetings. Lots of people don't have regular internet access or things like that, and all of our means of outreach and recruitment relied on face-to-face conversation. We did it all by door to door, and switching to flyering is really not effective. We had a couple really successful projects during COVID, like our free food distribution for people who it wasn't safe to go get groceries. But I think we're mostly just looking forward to things opening up and getting safer. I mean, our vaccination rates in Detroit are still pretty low, so that's a while off. But there's just not really a way to do what we're doing online. DBF, on the other hand, started during the pandemic, so we've kind of been adapted to that from the get-go, but it definitely made a big difference once it warmed up and we were able to start meeting outside.
Emre, would you like to comment potentially on COVID and Rojava in regards to stuff there at all?
Sure. I mean, I was there a few months before the pandemic, and I haven't been able to go, from the conversations I have with the comrades, dual approach, I could say. There's this emphasis to make sure there's not a shock doctrine where some, things are not normalized, and there's this concern for reminding, this is temporary, but also another emphasis that such pandemics may become more frequent with more disruption to nature, to, natural habitats, and with more destructive approach to other animals, other than humans. But in terms of organizing and what may become permanent, I would be able to speak better, I guess. There again. This summer, if for this permit me, I will.
The internet connection's not working right now, Emre. Would you maybe want to type out some of the stuff you were trying to say and we can read that out loud? Or hopefully internet connection can regain by then. That might actually help with bandwidth, honestly, with video, unfortunately. Is that working now, Emre? Let's see.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, a bit better.
Hello, can you hear
Yes.
me better?
Yes.
All right. I was just saying, I was just saying, from my I haven't been in the region since the pandemic began, so firsthand I'm not quite sure about what kind of what things may be becoming permanent, but from my conversations with the comrades there that I'm in communication with regularly, there's this dual approach where there's this emphasis of reminding folks this too shall pass, be aware of the shock doctrine, there's this emphasis of making sure education doesn't become just online, etc. But also there's awareness that such pandemics, such outbreaks may become more and more frequent with more disruption to nature and with the destructive relationship we have as humans with other animals. So I guess there is that dual approach, but I would be able to answer better once I'm there again, which I've been trying to do this summer, and we'll go if borders.
Thank you for that. Here in Olympia, it's also been very devastating. Similar to what Mason said, we are so reliant on face-to-face meetings and a social environment in relationship to that. That's been crucial to developing the kind of actions and projects that we've developed over the past years. Switching online, huge participation drop. That being said, surprisingly active, all things considered, when I really look back at it. Some of the activities that have happened were the rent strike and various tenants councils being formed in the early parts of the pandemic. some of which are still around, the Mutual Aid Fire Brigade project during fire season that then helped merge into other mutual aid projects locally that are now autonomous. Additionally, the study group we've had has been very active. Like there's 30 people who've participated probably throughout the last couple months. And that's where like a lot of the more active people have gone for the last couple months. And there's recently the Van Gardeners have started this awesome food forest project near one of the autonomous houseless camps in the forest. So there's actually been some pretty interesting activity. I think post-COVID going forward, one of the big things is during this last wave of action in the United States, there hasn't been enough time to have meetings with each other to talk stuff out. So I think one of the common patterns I've heard that happened in Olympia for sure is a actionism. So people getting very into having actions without having meaningful organization building and meetings, etc. So hopefully with all the new energy that can go into more epic projects that have ever happened locally potentially, because now police abolitionism is mainstream and mutual aid is mainstream in a way that I've never seen in the United States. So there's a lot of potential energy moving forward there. Next question, we have Nick, I believe.
Hi, yeah, thank you for all of the presentations so far. It's been really, really interesting. My question, I think is relevant to everyone, which is just how things are balanced in the work that your groups do, assemblies do, between like serving the community, organizing the community, and mobilizing the community.
I can take a stab at that first, if not of you are looking to. So what I would say is that we try to treat those not as different activities to weigh or balance against each other, but as things that can be unified. So I'll explain some like concrete examples from my neighborhood organization's work. So we when we were first setting out as a block club to try to decide what kind of issues we were going to work on and what kinds of activities we were going to prioritize, we kind of went into it with the mindset that it didn't actually matter what project we took up, so long as it was something that excited people and had like a very obvious way that their participation in it would benefit them and their neighborhood, and that through doing it as an organization, we would build the organization so that it's more capable of taking on other things. So for us, that first project was basically responding to illegal dumping. So our neighborhood has lots of blight, lots of abandoned houses, vacant lots, etc. And contractors will drive into the neighborhood in the middle of the night and dump a bunch of construction waste or random trash onto vacant lots, or even in like on a couple occasions in people's backyards. And so we organized like these regular cleanups and started, trying to do some patrolling, physically obstructing access to some of these lots and stuff, just to make it harder for these guys to do that. And so that was like our project for our first year, basically. And it got quite a few people involved. But then through it, we built this vehicle for collective action that could do lots of different things. And so that following summer, found out the city was trying to put an auto parts factory on the site of our old rec center, with no plans for environmental protections or pollution controls or anything like that. And so we were able to use that kind of like moment of political emergency to get whole bunches of new people involved, because we are a pre-existing container for a community response to what was happening, that people could just tap into. There was no need to build a new organization on this when we had a very tight timeline for being able to defeat this project, which we ultimately were able to. And so that brought loads of new neighbors into the community organization. And I think that was mostly a mobilizing project. We were trying to turn people out to public meetings. We went door to door to collect statements to submit online from neighbors. We were just trying to get pure numbers on this. But because it was in the context of having a pre-existing community organization that would have ongoing projects that they would be interested in, it was pretty straightforward to then channel that into, hey, we just accomplished this major victory by neighbors coming together. Here's these other stuff that we're trying to do. So it could be sort of solidified into not just mobilizing, but an organizing project. And on the service angle, we've done a variety of mutual aid things. But I think what's worked better for kind of sustaining activities that benefit everyone in the neighborhood is not really approaching it as a service project where like, you are the neighborhood, we are the organization, and we're going to give you this stuff. But rather using projects within the organization as things that people can get something out of by participating in them. So like with our community garden, it's basically run on communistic lines. Like there's no link between working on it and getting food from it. But if when people come to volunteer and to weed or clean it up at the end of the year, etc., we do those at the same time as pick days and things like that. And it kind of creates more of a continuity between participation in the project as something that is a commons, something that we're all part of, and getting access to the benefits from it. And I think that ended up being a lot more sustainable than our food delivery thing, which was more of a classic service model where you just ask to get something and other people will put in the work to do it for you. The main thing was just treating the organization as a container for all these different kinds of activities that can feed into each other as it's strengthened and has its capacity built up over time through these specific projects.
And so one thing I'd note is that all of those are going to feed into each other, right? And I'm going to just interpret service a little bit differently for the sake of my answer. I'm going to interpret service more serving the people, more just like helping people broadly. And I would say that the more we help people, the more interest there is in activity, and then people want to join the organization, and then maybe help mobilize people for other projects, right? I would note that even though there's multi-directional, if you will, feedback loops between helping people, mobilizing people, and organizing people, I would say getting people involved in self-organizing tends to be harder than mobilizing people, for example. I don't know about everybody else, but I got involved in direct action activity before I was going to meetings and doing the kind of work that goes into developing such activities, right? And I think that's the case for most people. So they tend to join a group after they're involved in certain kind of activities that group is doing to then help get involved in organizing with that group or self-organizing themselves in some other kind of project because they're influenced by it. And I guess we should go on to the next questions from here. Anissa.
Sorry, I'm going to talk from Nick's computer because it's easier. Can you all hear me?
Yeah.
Yep.
Yes.
Yes,
Cool.
we can.
Yep. So I kind of had two questions. One was just about, I think it's kind of been answered in your groups, is there different ideological affiliations? It sounds like it's pretty, everyone's kind of on the same page. It's not like I've been part of alliances which are trying to, you know, bring different lefty groups together. And that, yeah, can be really hard with the classic leftist splits and stuff. So I don't know if your groups work with, you know, other groups that have different ideological understandings. And then the second question is, yeah, is it all volunteer run, or are there people with wages or stipends or that sort of stuff? Thank you.
I could answer for Oli first. So I would say that there are a significant amount of anarchists and communalists involved, but there's a lot of people who are not anarchists and communalists involved. There's a lot of liberals, there's some Marxists, there's some more apolitical people who might not identify with any of those labels, etc. And one of the things is they don't have to agree to have any specific ideology. All they have to do to join the group, basically, if they want to be involved, any kind of agreement they make in that respect is just agreeing that it makes sense for this group to use direct action, mutual aid, direct democracy, basically, and horizontalist form and content within that group. And many people have joined from all sorts of worldviews and have been able to participate in common practices that we might define as libertarian socialist practices, but don't require any ideological agreement for that. And no one gets paid in Olympia Assembly. And one issue for groups in general is just how they're getting resources and money, and how they deal with that. We have that volunteer pool of funds, and then we have participatory budgeting, but we don't really pay ourselves at all.
Yeah, so Symbiosis as a whole, I think, has a fair bit of political diversity, you know, between the different member organizations as well as within them. But, you know, at our Congress, we did spend a lot of time kind of patching through what are we all on the same page about, and what are kind of the core things that we need to be on the same page about to be able to work together productively on this stuff. And so I'm just going to drop a link to the outcome of that, which was our points of unity document. And I think that kind of summarizes what are the core values, as well as like strategic orientation that we share. That's kind of like the foundation of the project. In Detroit Build and Fight, I think, you know, it's kind of a similar range, maybe a little bit more tightly on the same page than Olympia Assembly, but not dramatically so. We've been doing, you know, an internal study group as well to kind of like hone our shared analysis of what we're doing in the city. We just kind of passed you know, and agreed on a strategy document that sort of overviews what we see the purpose of our organization in the wider movement, and how we aim to pursue it together. So it's nothing like Democratic Socialists of America, where, you know, you have all kinds of different tendencies, so long as they're broadly on the left, because, you know, when you have a smaller local organization, I think it's pretty essential to at least have a shared sense of what you're doing together, even if you don't agree on all the details. And that's pretty difficult to pull off with people who have a totally different theory. I mean, yeah, everything in Detroit Build and Fight is all volunteer. All the roles in Symbiosis as a network are all volunteer, although there are individual member organizations that have staff. I think Cooperation Jackson has some paid staff. I think Athens for Everyone has some paid staff. Some of the more established ones that have a bit more of a foot in the nonprofit world have been able to get those resources, but Symbiosis as a whole is is a volunteer operation.
And for the sake of getting some questions to Emre, I'm going to move down the stack to Bradford. Bradford, are you there? I'll just read the question out loud then. Bradford says, I would like to hear more about the academies in Rojava, to Emre.
Sure. So the academies, like I said, social, these different four layers of political organizing, you know, the street assemblies, the district, I mean, the street assembly, the district, the regional, and the overall. They're organized along these 8 areas of activity that I mentioned, you know, economics, gender politics, etc. And all of these 8 themes have their own academies, right? So there's the Women's Academy, there's the Youth Academy, and these different academies are basically places where organic intellectuals within those specific fields are trained, equipped, and they go to both other academies, you know, to share information, strategies, but also cooperatives, communes, you know, like different settings, and there's this constant back and forth, you know, like if, for example, there's a scandal in some military unit of sexist behavior, that's immediately the Women's Academy intervenes and sends panelists, workshops. But this doesn't have to be, of course, like a incident scandal based. This also happens at a regular rate, you know, like at regular intervals. Like I said, one key description I would make about the academies is it's the space in which the revolution evolves and the different agents, actors of the revolution interact with one another on a, you know, academical setting. And for more information, I would like to echo Harrison's comment in the chat box. The book Revolution in Rojava by Aiboa, Flash, and Nup is very, I mean, it's great. It has a very detailed account of the academies as well. More and more books are coming out by Van Wilgenberg. There's a recent book on the political organizing and the assemblies and the autonomous administration that I highly recommend. Yeah, should I go on with the other Rojava specific questions?
I think we can probably take 1 or 2 other questions and then go to a Rojava specific question to give some time in between them.
Sounds good.
Next up, we have Laura.
Hey, so actually I have both a question for Mason and I'm sorry, what is your name? I see P. Ollie, but what's your actual name?
Phil.
Phil. Oh, right. You're Phil Provodkin. Okay. So yes, question for you two. And then I also do have a question for Emre that is Rojava specific. So my first question I wrote in the chat, which is, you know, I find that more than ideology, what really causes the breakdown in solidarity and movements and the real friction really comes from identity-based issues and inequalities of power and privilege structurally in the existing society and how those dynamics play out in grassroots movements. So I am interested to know how you have been dealing with challenges, because I'm sure they're coming up, surrounding issues of identity regarding race, gender, ability, class, etc. How do you navigate these challenges in a way that makes everyone feel heard and that their issues are addressed without it turning into an internal combustion situation? And the other thing I want to know about that is, have you ever dealt with any sort of, number one, any sort of harassment or interference from the authorities? And number two, specifically, have you dealt with any issues with undercover authorities trying to infiltrate your movements? Have you dealt with suspicions of that in any way and accusations of that? Because that's another thing that can cause friction and, dissolve movements. So I'm just wondering how you're dealing with all of those challenges. And then I don't know if I should just go straight to my question for Emre. I guess I'll just go quick to that. So Emre, my question for you is, I really love the way that you keep referring to non-human animals as other animals. And I noticed you did that more than once, and that really stood out to me. And I am wondering if the Rojava revolution, or the Kurds in general, with democratic and federalism, do you have any ideas about rethinking the human relationship of domination and exploitation with other animals? And if so, what are those ideas? And yeah, I just would love to hear about that aspect of it.
Bill, you want to go first?
Sure. So one thing that helps, but not exhaustively, is a horizontalist structure itself. Now, that's not an exhaustive answer. That's not a silver bullet, but I do think it is an important way to equalize in certain regards, and to create certain minimal dimensions of practices that at least aren't being violated to the degree that that actually is maintained and developed. Now, that's not a full answer. Other stuff that we do in regards to dealing with identity-related issues and the way those conflicts might arise, and how we organize in relationship to that. One thing we do is doing activities that are related to fighting oppression, right? And by doing that, it has a certain content. It attracts a certain kind of people. The entire assembly has a certain kind of cultural ethos in regards to doing those kinds of activities that are related to fighting oppression, etc. Now, that also doesn't exhaustively solve any of this. I don't think any of these will, but these are just different things that we do. Another thing is bigotry just not being culturally tolerated, right? That doesn't mean that there's not other ways that power dynamics of various kinds play out. But once again, that's a huge step if bigotry isn't culturally tolerated within a group because of the overall ethos of it. Another thing is talking with each other as a kind of mediation process, not necessarily in a formal way, but having dialogue with each other as a way of also solving this. And if needed, conflict resolution through face-to-face mediation. And that's, that can be like restorative justice and transformative justice in cases of harm. And we do have like a conflict resolution dimension to the assembly, and that was added by people who are very interested in transformative justice. And it's based off of things that the Eugene Neighborhood Anarchist Collective has on their website in large part, and also other stuff from transformative justice theory in relationship to it. And in regards to the undercover question and dealing with the authorities, yeah, the cops have arrested some people at actions. They've fortunately all been freed from their cells without having to deal with prison and charges. Eventually, all the charges have been dropped, which was good. They tried to get people on some really absurd, trumped up charges for some nonviolent direct action they did. And when it comes to dealing with undercovers or potential undercovers, well, one thing to do is to, of course, not jump the gun on accusations of someone being a cop if one doesn't actually have meaningful evidence for that, that's sufficient to prove that. And that helps a certain dynamic, because you don't want people just accusing people of being cops because of suspicions, for example. We're conscious that we're doing above ground organizing, and it comes with the potential of infiltrators, and it's hard for them to be in community with people, because Olympia Assembly is face-to-face. We exist socially, etc. It's very hard for them to meaningfully pretend to be part of the community. We know our neighbors, we know the faces around. That doesn't fully solve things, but that is definitely one thing that helps. And also just being smart about those dynamics, being aware that those are real threats, that anarchist movements, communist movements, socialist movements, leftist movements, anybody fighting for justice is going to have to deal with the fact that cops are going to try to quash movements that go against the status quo in various ways. Mason, would you like to give some responses to that?
Sure. I guess I'll just start with the undercover agents thing while I'm thinking about it. We've not had to deal with that, thankfully, not in Detroit Build and Fight or in the kinds of like neighborhood work that I've been involved with. I think mostly because it's still under the radar. However, to plan for that eventuality, we basically have a provisional membership system where new members need to be active for an extended period before they're allowed to participate in decision making, and there's hoops that have got to be jumped through that kind of raise the costs of trying to put an agent through it. And I don't think the local police department has any interest in trying that. On the subject of identity assemblies, I agree with Phil that the horizontal form is better footing for challenging those social hierarchies. But I think if you look at the kinds of mass movements that have utilized popular assemblies as kind of their political space, there's so many examples of ones in which there was not really significant shifts on like specifically questions of gender. I think is one of the main ones. So for example, indigenous assemblies all across Mexico is like a governing form for communal land. It's something that's been happening for at least since the Mexican Revolution in the early 20th century. And yet in almost all cases, these are very patriarchal. Men are the only ones who speak. I'm painting with a broad brush here. It's a very varied landscape, but that's very much the trend. It's in the first Intifada in Palestine in the 80s and 90s, a very similar situation in which there's kind of a revolutionary struggle taking place through face-to-face assemblies. But there was not a very concerted effort to involve women in the process. Women made incredible gains during this time, but it was not of the same kind of like social revolution character that we've seen in Rojava and in the Zapatista autonomous territory. And I think the thing that sets those two examples apart of how a horizontalist practice was able to turn into social revolution for upending the gender domination was that it was led by a revolutionary party organization that had a very specific, committed ideological focus on the liberation of women. And because there was that injection of like politicizing the issue of whether or not women speak, it had a really different effect down the road. If you look at assemblies in Chiapas now, it's almost like this has been a reversal. Women speak, 80% of the time. And that doesn't happen by accident. It happened through intentional internal political organizing that was like a core part of the revolutionary program. In Detroit, our context for these things is kind of different. Like Detroit Build and Fight is, I'm like one of the only cis people in the organization. We have one of the things that we've done to try to maintain like not having these issues scuttle the organization is basically there's a mandate that the organization has to remain majority Black. So if Detroit is an 80% Black city, and there's all kinds of like dead end radical organizations that have ended up being all white projects. And so basically, if any white people want to join the organization, we have to already have more than a majority of Black members. And if we don't, the new white recruits have to wait until we've gotten more. But with like the neighborhood organizations and stuff, it's a totally different landscape. I mean, most block clubs in Detroit are dominated by older Black women. The struggle is kind of getting young men to show up to these because they kind of have this stodgy reputation. But we do like intentional facilitation and things like that to try to keep balance in who's speaking and things like that. But it's sort of a different landscape when almost everyone in the room from the get-go is a woman. So I'll leave it at that.
Should I?
Yeah, go for it.
Yes.
I guess we're, as Kurds, we're a bit lucky that capitalist modernity hasn't infiltrated our society as strongly as it has done in some other parts of the world. Up until recently, this was described as backwardness from a modernist approach. But yeah, this relationship to other animals is strong, not just in academic circles like the one I belong to, but overall in society. There are no animal shelters in Rojava. Yeah, I mean, animals live freely, not just in urban areas with humans, as non-human animals and human animals live together. No sheltering collection process for other animals, and there's strong regulations against animal abuse. Not to say, to be self-critical. Of course, many animals are commodified, especially cows, sheep, etc. But yeah, no animal shelters, no pet shops, and there's this history and culture of convivir, and living together, I guess. So yeah, my main guess would be our luck has been that we haven't been as heavily modernized in the capitalist modernity sense of the word.
And next up, we have Max. Well, I guess I'll read out what Max wrote. Max wrote, how do the assemblies address gender diversity? Where do trans and non-binary people fit in? I can take that first. With Olympia Assembly, we disproportionately are trans and queer. So there's, similar to what Mason was saying, honestly, an issue of, where are the cis people at and to help join and share the responsibility and the fruits of the entire process. Mason, would you like to go, or did you kind of already?
Yeah, I don't have anything to add.
Yeah. All right. Next up, we have
Phil. I just want to do a time check. So we only have 22 minutes left, and we also have a bunch of questions. And I know there was hope to do breakouts. Could we do just like a temperature check if people want to do breakout groups versus powering through questions?
I'd go for the second because we have a lot of questions and I don't know if we'll have enough time for breakouts.
Well, maybe we can keep going ahead and people have strong views on want to do breakouts, say it in the chat and we can play it by ear.
One thing that could be done is we could go through the rest of the questions, close up on time, and if people want to discuss in the Discord, they could have a mass dialogue in the Discord about all the stuff potentially. Or we could even do small 30-minute breakouts after this if people want to, for those who want to participate. Seems like people who are saying questions in the chat, there's only 2 people saying anything. If anyone wants to do breakout, let us know and we'll try to find a way to accommodate in some respect. Whether that's Discord or whatnot.
Looks like we have 6 affirmatives for questions, 7 in the chat.
Awesome. So next up, we have Nick with a question.
Hey, yeah, I was just hoping Emre could talk a little bit more about the deindustrialization of agriculture and kind of like what that meant. Somebody responded with something helpful in the chat about some of the history of where it was coming from, but I was just curious what that meant, if that meant that there was like a lot more labor going into agriculture, if that meant that like it was local production for local consumption or some combination, or yeah. Absolutely.
Those two together. Let me start from that brief historical context that was shared in the chat box. The Syrian regime, up until the Rojava revolution, had viewed the region as the breadbasket of entire Syria. For that, it only allowed the growth of wheat and barley for decades. Only wheat and barley. Forestation was completely banned. You would get fined if you were found planting a tree. They would actually remove trees to make up for wheat and barley fields. This heavy monoculture, heavily industrialized, machinized model of agriculture, it's been flipped upside down. There's this great emphasis on cooperatives, right? The street or the village commune assembly decides to set up a cooperative, and there's this attempt to transition to a cooperative-based economy. Unfortunately, has still not taken place. The cooperative production can only make up for like 1 to 2% of internal consumption. However, within the growing model, it's much less industrialized, much more labor going into, and almost all the production is, 100% of the production is for like local consumption. Much like first for Rojava, and whatever remains is sold to other parts of Syria, working with the Assad regime. So absolutely those two, much more labor going, much less industry. Unfortunately, still heavy use of oil, because alternative sources of energy are not that accessible in terms of war and embargo. But yeah, much less mechanized and much more laborized, where more and more people are becoming, cooperative members and owners of their labor.
Thanks for that answer. And next up, we have Harrison.
Hi. I guess it kind of goes back to what you were talking about earlier regarding practical on-the-ground organization. and kind of getting everyone involved in setting up democratic locality-based structures. I kind of have a question regarding, obviously Olympia is not Seattle. However, I kind of have a question regarding, you know, things that have been popping up all over the United States, the quote unquote autonomous zones in Seattle and in, I don't know, George Floyd Square, I don't remember what state that's in. These things come up, and I've seen so many critiques of how these have been going, because obviously a lot of people are aware in these, you know, occupied zones where people are trying to set up assemblies that meet every day, are trying to set up organized self-defense, are trying to set up these alternatives. There's, you know, more than one shooting per week in a lot of these places, and these attempts at democratization have not succeeded in any way, even though they're trying to use these methods. So do you have any, I suppose, analysis of that, and maybe like how do we avoid that if we're trying to do like ways to actually organize that well?
From like a security perspective specifically?
Broadly, like the connection. I've seen people write, oh, well, these happened because they were totally unorganized and they were just ran, you know, and there was no attempt at democratization, but that's not really true. There are, like, there were, you know, many attempts at setting up assemblies to organize generally, and yet all of them have very quickly devolved into, I mean, there was another shooting just recently at the George Floyd Square. And then there was an attempt by the police to come in and respond to that, and then people fighting back against that, and so on.
I mean, I don't really know the George Floyd Square details very well, but I definitely followed the Capitol Hill autonomous zone pretty closely, and I think one of the defects and this is something that, you know, Occupy suffered from greatly as well, is that by laying claim to public spaces in sort of like this new insurgent way, the organizations that they're setting up are to like administer that space have been conjured up out of nothing, essentially. And I think a much more stable and, you know, less sexy, slower paced approach is, you know, rests on necessity of having pre-existing structure and community organization for the management of common space. And so, you know, you have with these kinds of places that are a specific park or something in like a particular neighborhood that becomes a lightning rod for political action. You know, what was happening with Capitol Hill was all these people coming from all over the place who thought the thing was exciting, the project. You know, maybe they support it for ideological reasons or for adventurous ones or whatever. And you know, that's kind of a breeding ground for conflict, where, you know, it's not actually the self-determination of the people in a given neighborhood who are organizing along lines, because there's not a pre-existing community organization that is making decisions, and you know, that comes with lots of risks of you know, how things are to be run, and you know, the kind of like core administrative things that need to be worked out for you know, things like food security, waste management, etc., are ones that really cannot be built in a day. And that's why I think it's really crucial for, you know, people who believe in assembly democracy as a practice to try to build the foundations of it right now, as kind of a preparatory step towards being able to seize space. And though that's where you can have strong security protocols, or things where like you are not gonna I don't think anyone doing this for their own neighborhood wants random people from other places showing up with guns. And yet that was what was happening in Capitol Hill, because there was nothing before the occupation to kind of like make those restrictions, or be the real decision-making institution over the space.
Yeah, I'd echo a lot of what Mason said. Basically, these structures, they grew too fast, not enough structure, mission, purpose. Old society then still exists. And then additionally, the absence of a hierarchical enforcement agency is going to be necessary for a more peaceful society, but that's not sufficient. Arbitrary power can exist where people try to just wield their authority as they will, as they're able to, with might or whatnot. And I'd just say that police aren't a meaningful solution to that problem, because police are going to enforce the overall hierarchical society, which is going to be the biggest overall cause we know of such kind of arbitrary interpersonal violence towards persons. And if people want to look into that kind of research, you can check out research by Wilkinson and Pickett on the effects of structural violence and overall rates of violence. And it is the single most salient factor, that the more overall inequality in society, the more deprivation of resources absolutely or relatively within a society, that's going to be the biggest cause of overall violence. And cops, by definition, are there to enforce those class relations. So I would note that cops aren't a solution to that either. And additionally, a lot of that like violence did come from outside people with guns coming in to take advantage of others, because it became a media hotspot that everyone was aware of. And so there's, once again, it's insufficient to merely kick the cops out of a couple blocks. There needs to be that kind of long-term horizontalist power to fill that power vacuum and to create the kind of meaningful freedom that we need. And I guess, Emre, do you have any thoughts on any of this, or should we go to the next questions?
Sure, I was focusing on the next question, to be honest, but should I read out the question? I think Issa said not in a good setting to speak. Can you read my question?
Yeah, perfect.
How do the communist cooperatives conceive of concepts like crime or justice in a theoretical sense, and how do they resolve legal disputes, for lack of a better term, in a practical sense? And lastly, you mentioned how ecology is at the forefront of academies and required readings, and I was wondering if you could speak more specifically on how they practically structure their relationship between ecology, earth, and society when they try to implement that theory. Broad statistics, there are two types of prisons in Rojava: the ISIS prisons and the rest, like the general prisons. The ISIS prisons, of course, for former ISIS members and their families, and the regular prisons for, all other quote-unquote crimes. About 70 to 80% of people imprisoned in the regular prisons are men who are there for gender violence issues. Gender violence is strictly enforced. Although I emphasized ecology in revolution, I'd say it is foremost a women's revolution, and gender violence is not tolerated at all. Women who experience different forms of gendered violence, they don't have to deal with males, quote unquote, authority figures, from the judge to the asayish person, like the, I guess, self-defense person dealing with the case. They all have to be women. But reconciliation and informal ways are much more preferred. For example, like every other part of the world, traffic accidents are major occurrences, and most traffic accidents, even if they result in death, actually don't end up going to court because they're resolved through informal processes of reconciliation. Also, formally known like blood feuds. Similarly, I guess here my answer is tying into Anisa's question about conflict resolution resources and processes. These informal conflict resolution processes
Emre, we lost you again. Are you there? I guess for sake of time, let's move on to the other questions and then come back to this question when Emre regains some internet connection. Ben, what was your question? Ben, are you there?
Everybody's muted.
Ben, do you have a question? Okay, I guess let's go to Roberto.
Yes, speaking about these autonomous zones, it's pretty clear to me that they were not coming up from below organically. They were kind of like top-down ideas that were imposed from the outside. Even a group like yours, which has a lot of autonomy already in groups that are assemblies rather. I don't see you guys doing that even now because you're not quite ready either. I don't think hardly anybody in the whole country is ready to really have a successful autonomous zone. So if anybody wants to start one, you better question their motives, and make sure that it's done from an organic base in the local community that actually wants it. And that's pretty far from happening as far as I can tell. The other thing is that, when the question of like, get rid of the police, you can't just get rid of the police because you invite all kinds of people that want to do nasty things. Well, you don't invite them, but they'll see that they go there's no cops there, so we'll go in there and do this stuff. And I think that's what happened actually in Washington. So you need to have in place a restorative justice or transformative justice, program in place that is controlled by the community. And obviously it wasn't there. So I just wanted to let you know if you think that makes sense. Ask you rather. Mason or Ollie, whatever, whoever can answer.
I mean, on the subject of not being ready, couldn't agree more. It is, I think to meaningfully achieve an autonomous territory, that is a years, if not decades long project, not a weekend one.
Yeah, and I'd say not only is abolishing the cops insufficient, even abolishing other terrible things is insufficient. We also have to have, as you said, Roberto, we need to have that positive conception of what we're building in the place of those hierarchical power structures. And without meaningful horizontalist power and people-powered alternatives like restorative justice, transformative justice, etc., and without getting rid of some of the root causes of such arbitrary violence, all you're going to see is just one, just the cops going away is insufficient for a meaningful revolution. Even hierarchy going away is insufficient for that. You also need to have the presence, the active presence of things like mutual aid, you name it, etc.
One other thing I would like to add as a question to that is, what do you think of groups like in Oklahoma? We have the Socialist Rifle Association, which is a separate group. It's not really held accountable by any other group. And I don't think that's the right way to go myself. What do you think about that? In a self-defense militia type group. Mason or whoever.
Well, I think it depends on their function and their orientation. I don't think it is productive for those to like present themselves and function themselves as the community defense organization. We've had a really positive relationship with our local closest analog to that, which I think may have split off from the SRA. It's called the Michigan People's Defense League. And how they approach it is instead as more of like an educational organization. So like our block club had members that was interested in doing armed self-defense training or community defense. And so we reached out to them saying, hey, are you equipped to like run trainings for community groups? And so like they don't do as themselves as an organization, like armed patrols or showing up at protests or things like that. They're kind of like more functioning as providing expert support for community organizations that would have a more like accountable to the neighborhood structure for how that works. But you know, when it comes to community defense, I think I would just like amend what Mao Zedong said about the army, which is we've got to make sure that the party controls the gun and the gun can never be allowed to control the party. I mean, for a more participatory democratic model, I would say the same for the assemblies. I don't think there should be any capacity for organized violence or armed struggle that's not very firmly under the control of, you know, our processes of direct democracy. I think it needs to be an expression of the self-determination of your neighborhood or whatever your unit of political organization is. Because if it's not, that can be such a threat to everything that we're building, even if the people doing it, you know, think they're on your side.
Well, it looks like we're at time. Unfortunately, we didn't get to have a full answer from Emre on that question about crime and justice in Rojava. So hopefully we can get a written response by Emre that we can present to everybody in the upcoming days of the intensive. Would like to thank everybody for joining us for this panel and participating in the Q&A. I encourage people to check out the Discord server if people want to have continued dialogue on any of these topics and things like that, and talk with like-minded people about all these tough questions about how to apply the general principles and practices of social ecology and sibling tendencies to particular contexts. And yeah, that's about it. Do you have any closing words, Mason?
Well, Blair asked me to just note to remind people that we're starting tomorrow at 1:30 p.m. Eastern time with the healthcare panel, and hope to see most of you all there.
All right, take care, everybody.